I'm going to tell you the story about the correspondence between Bill Wilson and Carl Jung. And this slide is the saying that was inscribed over Jung's house. And you can read what it says, and it basically is just the presence of God everywhere in everything. And he also has it inscribed on his, it was inscribed on his tombstone. So, Alcoholics Anonymous and analytical psychology were both birthed by incredible spiritual visionaries who influenced and changed the lives of millions of people around the world. Today I'm going to tell you one story behind the 1961 correspondence between Carl Jung and Bill Wilson. To place the letters in a historical context, I will summarize some key experiences in both men's lives that led up to that event. First, Jung's life situation in 1931, when he accepts Roland H. into his practice. He is the patient who was the first link, as many of you know, in the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. And second, Wilson's 1944 to 1955 intermittent depressions, his psychotherapy, and the relevance of writing the 12 traditions as an addition to the 12 steps as an aspect of his spiritual development. I will then review and reflect on their letters. Jung and Wilson they both suffered from long periods of despair, alienation, disorientation. That's part of what, when we read it, it just makes us feel less alone. Both found life-giving parts of themselves in a process of surrender, ego deflation, and courageous self-searching. Both suffered from what William James called Zerrissenheit, which is torn apartness. Zerrissenheit, torn apartness. Last night I was thinking, what is the essence of what I want to convey to you? And I realized it's this, that Jung and Wilson survived their ordeals by relying on a power greater than themselves. Their strength lay in their human flaws and in their imperfections. They asked for help that allowed them to accomplish great things. Both came to find a balanced and interactive relationship between human and divine. Matt, next slide. Thank you. In the 1970s, when I was in my first Jungian analysis, I encountered the 12-step programs by chance. My analyst mentioned the correspondence between Bill Wilson, the co-founder of AA, and Carl Jung, and gave me a copy. I read the letters and was moved by the immediacy of their deep and vital connection. Over the years, I've mentioned this correspondence to patients, to other people in the 12-step programs, to other Jungian analysts. And some know of this connection, the Wilson-Jung connection, yet most have never studied the letters. Now, I asked that you all would get copies of the letters. Have you gotten that? So maybe you'll get it on the way out. Okay.
Or I'll get them to you.
They're on the internet, but you'll get them. Okay. So this is just, you all know something about Jungian analysis, Jungian psychotherapy. It's very interwoven, and I just put this slide up to show some of Jung's major contributions to the fields of psychology. Next slide. Let me start at the beginning with Jung and a brief comment about Jungian psychology and addiction. Jung's psychology is the only analytic theory accounting for the spiritual motive in any other way than defensive. Freudian psychology stigmatized the religious attitude as being infantile, and if appearing in a grown person, it was seen as regressive. Jung said, quote, "The thirst for wholeness is the essence of the spiritual quest." This quest is synonymous with the archetype of individuation. This is a slide which I don't know how well you can see, by Remedios Varo, who's one of my favorite surrealist painters. And it just shows this woman, which is Remedios herself, as a person unto herself. And I think that's part of what individuation is. It's a person becoming him or herself, whole, indivisible, and distinct from other people or collective psychology, finding the one in the many. We all long for individuation, but what if the seeker gets stuck in what the Buddhists call the realm of the hungry ghost, where the inhabitants have scrawny necks, small mouths, bloated empty bellies, and insatiable hunger? That is the domain of addiction, that insatiable hunger, the insatiable thirst, where we constantly seek something outside of ourselves to curb an unquenchable desire for relief or fulfillment. Addiction itself is also an archetype, but it is thirst without the wholeness. Many of us and our patients deal with an addiction that has its roots in early childhood or in life traumas. Many have interwoven the 12-step programs into this search for wholeness. I imagine that some of you saw the David Cronenberg film. Can I see a hand of how many of you saw A Dangerous Method? Okay, so some of you. I'm not going to talk about that film, which would be a very interesting discussion, but not right now. And so it's a film that came out last year. I suggest that you see it. It's interesting. It's very provoking, but it's very interesting. That came out last year about the relationship between Jung, Freud, and one of their mutual patients, Sabine Spielrein. There's a postscript to the film which says C.G. Jung suffered a prolonged nervous breakdown during the First World War, from which he emerged to become eventually the world's leading psychologist. That statement is an inaccurate portrayal of historical events. What did happen was that from 1913 to 1930, a very world-weary Jung who had become successful at an extremely early age, that most probably also as a result of partially as a result of his traumatic break with Freud, went into an emotional descent and was immersed in a profound confrontation with his unconscious. Next slide. However, for the entire time, he saw patients, wrote, and had a life with family and colleagues, hardly a nervous breakdown as any of us would think of it. He developed a technique of active imagination that enabled him to get to the bottom of his inner processes. During this time, he recorded his experience in a spiritual memoir, The Red Book, which was published in 2009. Have any of you people know about The Red Book, have seen it? Some of you. It's a very heavy tome. I think it's 14 pounds. And it's been quite a bestseller, even though it's very expensive, and it's got beautiful illustrations in it. It gives us a unique insight into Jung's realization of his own soul loss, his process of recovering it, and the experience of a rebirth of a new image of God inside himself. Throughout the work, he is confronted with the problem of the restless souls desperately seeking for an answer. His task was to get over, quote, this is from one of the people that studied the Red Book, to get over his egoistic ambition and pride and to transform his conscious attitude into a receptive vessel to the divine. So that was his task, was to change from this inflation that he was having in his life and his profession, and become a vessel, a very feminine place to the divine. Now this is a picture of the original Red Book that was went to some of the different museums. It was in LA and New York, and it's a very big leather-bound copy that's in, I'm not going to talk much more about it, but it's in probably a vault right now, but there are many copies that are for sale. Many years later, in 1957, he described his process of working on the Red Book. He said, "The years when I pursued the inner images were the most important time of my life. It began at that time, and later details hardly matter anymore. My entire life consisted in elaborating what had burst forth from the unconscious and flooded me like an enigmatic stream and threatened to break me." And so some people saw that as a nervous breakdown. Some people see it as divine madness. But really all that Jung's work that came in these years afterwards originated from the experiences he had in those years. So slide 2, please. Go ahead. So this is one, he did these illustrations. They don't necessarily match what's written, but these were things, and he didn't have a major art background, but he had some art background. And sorry these aren't better. You can see a lot of it on the internet. Next slide. And this just is an image. There's a huge serpent down here on this ship that's on a journey. The ship, this is sort of symbolic of wholeness. And this huge serpent underneath, that sort of conveys what was going on inside of him at one point. So 1 year after emerging from that journey, in 1931, Jung accepted a new patient, Roland Hazard, into his practice. How many of you know about Roland Hazard? Okay, so this is AA history. Hazard was an alcoholic, and it was his sobriety that helped lead to the creation of Alcoholics Anonymous in 1935. Under Jung's care for a year in Switzerland, Roland stayed sober. However, he relapsed upon his return to the United States. There is an account of Jung's treatment of Roland in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. In the chapter, there is a solution. And Roland is described, but not by name. He's described before his relapse, when he comes back to the States, as having, quote, unusual confidence. His physical and mental condition were unusually good. Above all, he believed he had acquired such a profound knowledge of the inner workings of his mind and its hidden springs that relapse was unthinkable. Nevertheless, he was drunk in a very short time. It is indeed humbling to think that even Jung could not cure Roland. And I often sit in my office and remind myself when I'm trying to get someone into recovery, the mantra, well, Jung couldn't do it either. Jung couldn't do it either. So it's helpful, and I'm wanting to help you to remember that no human power can do that. So feeling hopeless, Roland returned to Switzerland. He was obviously a wealthy man. It was the 1930s, 1931. Feeling hopeless, Roland returned to Switzerland, and Dr. Jung counseled that the only hope was, quote, to become the subject of a spiritual or religious experience, unquote, which might inspire him when nothing else could. Jung was speaking directly from his own inner experience of surrender and renewal that he began to emerge from in the year before. Next slide, please. So this is a picture of Roland Hazard, the young man who went to see Jung, his patient. Roland did pursue a spiritual path through the Oxford groups and remained sober. The Oxford groups were a non-denominational Christian fellowship in the 30s with a focus on spiritual development and one person working with another to change their lives. They had some success in helping alcoholics to gain sobriety. And the Oxford groups, if you learn more about them, are very interesting, or an interesting group to study. While involved in the Oxford groups, Roland reconnected and helped an old friend, Ebby Thatcher. Next slide. And I think that we hear about Ebby, in AA history as a friend, and Bill Wilson refers to Ebby at some points as his sponsor. So it's Bill Wilson on the right and Ebby Thatcher on the left. And it was Ebby. How many of you saw that recent film that came out about Bill Wilson? Okay, so the scene in the kitchen is Ebby coming to see him. It's a pretty famous scene. It was Ebby who brought the news to a demoralized and completely hopeless Bill Wilson about this new approach, this new spiritual approach to alcoholism. Bill Wilson sobered up in the Oxford group in December 1934. He met Dr. Bob Smith, and together they founded Alcoholics Anonymous in 1935. Many of you probably know the history of Alcoholics Anonymous, and for those of you who would like to learn more, one place to start is with Ernst Kurtz in a book called Not God. I believe it's a Hazleton publication. Bill Wilson, like many alcoholics and addicts, suffered from severe depression. There are varied accounts about Bill's depression, but we do know he was deeply suffered intermittently between 1944 and 1955. He questioned, this is in his own writings, if he was manic depressive, if he had a chemical imbalance. Nearly 10 years after getting sober, still unhappy and blaming himself for not doing the steps better and more thoroughly and all that, which people talk about. In 1945, he sought professional help from Dr. Harry Tiebout, a Freudian psychiatrist who stressed the regressive dynamics of alcoholism. The doctor urged Bill to accept that he was in the grips of his own immaturity. Quote, that both in his active alcoholism and in his current sobriety, he had been trying to live out the infantile, grandiose demands of His Majesty the Baby. That's where that phrase came from. Although the sessions with Tiebout sharpened Bill's self-awareness, his self-knowledge, and reduced his fear of losing his mental balance altogether, he found them not to be especially curative. And another source that's a lot of this information in is another book called Pass It On, which is the story of Alcoholics Anonymous as well. Wilson's depression continued at a lower level of intensity, and he found some relief in alternative treatments, hormones, dietary changes. He cut his sugar dramatically, and he did daily 5-mile walks and did intensive focused depth breathing, kind of what we'd call mindfulness, I guess, or breath work. In 1947, he found a Jungian analyst in New York, Frances Gillespie Wicks. He worked with her weekly for about 2 years. Her first book was called The Inner World of Childhood. I don't know if any of you know the book. It had an introduction by Jung, and it was very popular in the 1930s. During his work with Wicks, he went through a process, much like Jung did when he described in his autobiography, of meeting a personality number 1 and a personality number 2, which was basically a false self and a true self. Bill wrote a letter describing what Wicks was thinking, Wicks's feedback and reflections about him. Bill said in this letter, her thesis is that my position in Alcoholics Anonymous has become quite inconsistent with my needs as an individual. Highly satisfactory to live one's life for others, it cannot be anything but disastrous to live one's life for others as those others think it should be lived. One has, for better or worse, to choose his own life. That still gives me the chills. The extent to which the AA movement and the individuals in it determine my choices is really astonishing. Things which are primary to me, even for the good of AA, are unfulfilled. So we have the person of Mr. Anonymous in conflict with Bill Wilson. Wicks felt that Bill had become so identified with AA that he had lost his sense of self. With her help, he continued his own individuation process while simultaneously letting go of his identification with AA, which had become sort of a false self. He said of his psychotherapy, it took down my fear of the depression, but the effect was not positive enough to fully overcome them. The years of Bill's depressions were also a period when he conceived of the 12 traditions. And this historically, for a lot of people, is very interesting. Because with the 12 traditions, there are the guiding principles about how individual groups should govern themselves. So it was an attempt that Bill was making to let go of AA and trust a structure. So it was a huge surrender for someone that could have been the czar of AA. Next slide, please. This is one of the earlier books, but it's the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions. Originally, it was just the 12 Steps. It wasn't 12 Steps and 12 Traditions. Bill wrote that the whole AA traditions, in a sense, are the result of my gradual adjustment to reality. Adding the traditions to the steps was about the deflation that each of us has to take, of the sacrifice that we shall all have to make in order to live and work together. Several early AA members thought that Bill's depressions were a result of spiritual exhaustion, which is actually an interesting way to think about depression. After AA, quote, after 1955, the year that Bill declared AA of age, the service structure was complete and he turned the fellowship over to its members. He was then free of depression. And so it was a remarkably spiritual event for that to occur, for him to write them and for them to be accepted into the Alcoholics Anonymous. So the correspondence. Let's get to the next slide. There's a picture of Bill Wilson. It's the famous coffee pot. In the late 1950s, Bill's organizational activities lessened, and one of the projects he planned for his retirement was to complete an unfinished task, to acknowledge AA's indebtedness to countless people he felt were responsible for its creation. At the top of his list was Carl Jung, who had pointed Roland, Ebbe, and himself in a spiritual direction that opened the way to recovery. He wanted to inform and thank Jung for the key role, unbeknownst to Jung, that he had played in the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill Wilson and Carl Jung exchanged letters in January 1961. Bill wrote 2 letters and Jung 1. Bill's second letter was written March 20th, 1961 and never answered. Jung died in June 1961. So this is a letter from Bill Wilson, part of the letter I'm going to read you, and you'll all have to read it on your own. January 23rd, 1961. And just to think, Bill wrote this letter, and then a week later, Jung answered, which is really pretty remarkable when most of us think about Jung's schedule, at least I do. So he wrote, and I'm just going to take very small parts out. Wilson, as you know, is a prodigious speaker and writer. So he wrote a long letter. I'm not going to subject that right now. So, my dear Dr. Jung, this letter of great appreciation has been very long overdue. May I first introduce myself as Bill W., a co-founder of the Society of Alcoholics Anonymous. Though you have surely heard of us, I doubt if you're aware that a certain conversation you once had with one of your patients, Roland H., back in the early 1930s, did play a critical role in the founding of our fellowship. It was a long, end quote. It was a long letter, and Bill reviews what happened to Roland, the relapse, his return to see Jung, as well as Jung's admission that his case was hopeless, and that there was nothing more he could do for him. Quote, this candid and humble statement of yours was beyond doubt the first foundation stone upon which our society was built. And then I skip a little bit, and he says, when Roland asked you if there was any other hope, you told him there might be, provided he could become the subject of a spiritual or religious experience. In short, a genuine conversion. Roland did find a conversion experience that released him from his compulsion to drink, end quote. And Jung tells about Roland's experiences, the Oxford group. He then goes on to describe how the message reached him, his own desperation in his alcoholism, his spiritual awakening, the founding of AA, and the spiritual experiences of many thousands of his members. As Bill put it, quote, this concept proved to be the idea of a spiritual experience, proved to be the foundation of such success as Alcoholics Anonymous has since achieved, unquote. He tells Jung that many AA members are students of his writings, quote, because of your conviction that man is something more than intellect, emotion, and $2 worth of chemicals. You have especially endeared yourself to us. So to you, to Dr. Shoemaker of the Oxford groups, to William James, and to my own physician, Dr. Silkworth, we of AA owe this tremendous benefaction. As you will now clearly see, this astonishing chain of events actually started long ago in your consulting room. And it was directly founded upon your own humility and deep perception. Please be certain that your place in the affection and in the history of the fellowship is like no other. Gratefully yours, William G. W., co-founder, Alcoholics Anonymous. So, Jung's response arrives a week later, January 30th, 1961. Next slide, please, Matt. So even though you didn't get to see the first part in the beginning, some of these pictures are from there. And I'll tell you at the end where that little video came from. Picture of Jung resting by the lake in Lake Geneva in Kuznacht. Next slide, please. This is a slide of the original letter that Jung wrote to Bill Wilson. And the original is in Stepping Stones, which was Bill and Lois Wilson's house in upstate New York. And it was one of his most important totems that he treasured this letter. Dear Mr. Wilson, your letter has been very welcome indeed. I had no news from Roland H. anymore and often wondered what had been his fate. Our conversation, which he has adequately reported to you, had an aspect of which he did not know. The reason that I could not tell him everything was that those days I had to be exceedingly careful of what I said. But what I really thought about was the result of many experiences with men of his kind. His craving for alcohol was the equivalent on a low level of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness, expressed in medieval language, the union with God. Next slide, please. This is a slide of Philemon, who Jung came to realize was his spiritual guide, came out of him, and this was a painting that Jung did that's in the Red Book. Probably some of you have seen this. Philemon from Greek means that it's an image of one who loves soul. Jung shared additional reflections on the nature of alcoholism with Wilson, information he never said to Roland in the 1930s because he was apprehensive that he would be understood by the scientific community. I mean, if you can think where psychology and depth psychology was, he sounded cuckoo, you know? And people thought he was psychotic. When Winnicott reviewed his autobiography and called him a psychotic. You know, so there were many things that he was having to struggle against that we don't think about now. And this deep concern that he had about his community was one of the reasons that the Red Book hadn't come out until 2009. And I just have a few more minutes. Although there are about 20 references to alcoholism in the 20 volumes of his collected works, without these letters, we would have next to nothing of Jung's core ideas on addiction and alcoholism. Jung says, the only right in the letter, the only right and legitimate way to such an experience is that it happens to you in reality. And it can only happen to you when you walk on a path which leads to higher understanding. You might be led to that goal by an act of grace, or through a personal and honest contact with friends, or through a higher education of the mind beyond the confines of mere rationalism. I see from your letter that Roland H. has chosen the second way, which was, under the circumstances, obviously the best one. Unquote. The necessity of a spiritual experience for transforming addiction is widely recognized as Jung's major contribution to the 12-step programs. However, the letter reveals that Jung actually stressed the three concepts that became the bedrock of AA: take a spiritual path, engage in a supportive community, and enlarge your spiritual life. All things that are really also seen in in how these things affect the mind. And neuroscience talks about all these things, all the receptors, dopamine, and everything else that happens when you're in these kinds of situations. Jung continues, I am strongly convinced that the evil principle prevailing in this world leads the unrecognized spiritual need into perdition, if it is not counteracted by either real religious insight or by the protective wall of a human community. An ordinary man, not protected by an action from above, and isolated in society, cannot resist the power of evil, which is called very aptly the devil, unquote. With this last statement and the use of the word devil, Jung brings alcoholism into the archetypal realm, specifically into the darkness and spiritual destruction that is even more encompassing than the personal shadow. Jung is suggesting here an ultimate archetypal battle of the powers of good and evil for the souls of human beings. Jung sensed the immense power and transpersonal quality in addiction and knew ultimately that to treat it, it required a transpersonal, transcendent self-medicine. Blue angels. Jung wrote in his letter that it was no accident that alcohol is also called spirits, and said that the alcoholic's thirst for alcohol is equivalent to the soul's thirst for the union with God. He wrote, alcohol in Latin is spiritus, and you use the same word for the highest religious experience as well as the most depraving poison. The helpful formula, therefore, is spiritus contra spiritum, which means you use the spirit against the spirits. It's kind of an alchemical formula. Thanking you again for your kind letter, I remain yours sincerely, C.G. Jung. AA adopted the concept of the higher power to describe these realities. Jung used the terms of the self and the archetypes and many other things as the central structures of the psyche that represent these universal spiritual and psychological principles. Just one last, Jung said in the Red Book, my friends, it is wise to nourish the soul, otherwise you will breed dragons and devils in your heart. Thank you.
Thank you.